Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. My name is Stephen Saum, and I'm the Executive Director of Strategic Communications and Content at St. Mary's College of California, just across the bay. Okay. So now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest. Joyce Vance is a distinguished professor of the practice of law at the University of Alabama School of Law, and author of Giving Up is Unforgivable, a manual for keeping a democracy. Previously, Joyce Vance served as the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama. On the eve of Donald Trump's first inauguration, she resigned, ending 25 years of dedicated service as a federal prosecutor. In addition to teaching, Vance is a legal analyst for MSNBC, the author of the popular Civil Discourse, Substack, and co-host of two podcasts, hashtag Sisters-in-Law, and, right, some fans in the house, and Cafe's Insider. All right. Welcome. Thank you. Well, Joyce, welcome, and thanks so much for joining us here this evening. Congratulations on your new book, your first book, right?
Thank you, yes.
Let me start off by asking you a question that you actually address in the book, and that a longtime friend and art director I've worked with on a magazine for the Peace Corps community asked me. Is it time for us to pack our bags?
So look, I would say this. We are not quitters, right? And we have a republic to keep. So I'm not packing my bags other than for this book tour, and I hope you guys will stick around too.
So one of the things that you address in the book, there's a moment where you talk about a gathering of U.S. attorneys from across the country when President Obama spoke to all of you and said, I appointed you, but you don't serve me, you serve the American people, and I expect you to act with independence and integrity. So one, talk about that and what that means now. And two, I'll observe, as you do in the book, that moment took place in the East Wing of the White House.
Well, thank you for resurrecting that very painful experience that I had when I first saw the East Wing of the White House go kablooey. It is unbelievable, I think. And look, as a people, we've stopped feeling surprise and horror, I think, because you can't feel it every day. But I'm trying to indulge a certain amount of shock and horror at the destruction of the East Wing, where I went with each of my 4 children on their White House trips. And now those trips, if you take a look at the White House's website, have been indefinitely canceled, which seems like such a tragic loss for the future, but also a deliberate slap in the face of the American people delivered by the president, which makes you wonder, right? What's at work here? What's afoot? It's very different from the experience that my generation of U.S. attorneys had with President Obama, who, although in many ways, was a born comedian, was very funny and very off the cuff, was very serious when it came to ethics and the rule of law and our jobs. And the joy of having a constitutional law scholar as a president was that he could deliver these important comments in a very informal way. And it was a moment, that for my generation of U.S. attorneys still lives with all of us. This moment where Barack Obama looks at you and says, you don't serve me, you serve the people in your districts. And that was really what I wanted to do, both as a line prosecutor and as a U.S. attorney. If you work for the Justice Department, your mission has to be service. It can't be advancing your own personal career or, bootlicking your current boss. It just has to be about the people. We desperately need to regain that when this is over, but it's going to be a very long road back.
Now, you actually joined the U.S. Attorney's Office in 1991
I did.
when George H.W. Bush.
I'm a
president.
Republican hire.
So talk about that, and one of the things you talk about in the book, some of the recent members of the Justice Department who have resigned.
Right. So it's a tragedy to lose that sort of career experience and institutional knowledge, these losses that we've seen at the Justice Department. You know, some firings, some folks who have resigned in lieu of being fired. And the first inkling that we had, by we I mean people who used to work at the Justice Department, but the American people writ large too, was very early on in this presidency when FBI agents were fired or demoted because they had worked on cases involving January 6th or this president, cases that they had been assigned to. And when you're an FBI agent, you don't get to walk into the boss's office and say, I'll work on this investigation and this one, but not so much that one, right? You work on whatever you're assigned to. Some of these people were asked to run innocuous leads. You know, if you had a January 6th defendant who came from Denver, the Denver RA got some leads, and whichever agent, whoever's turn it was to run those leads, ran them down. Suddenly, people found themselves really in front of the firing squad just for doing their jobs. And that was concerning. And then it got worse, right? In New York City, where Eric Adams, the mayor, was under indictment on public corruption charges in a solid case, indicted by a grand jury moving forward, and the acting U.S. attorney, a woman named Danielle Sassoon, who was a career prosecutor, member of the Federalist Society, was in place because she had friendships with other U.S. attorneys, or rather other assistant U.S. attorneys from the Southern District of New York, who were now in high-ranking positions in DOJ. And when she declined to dismiss the case against New York City's mayor, she too was forced to leave, along with people in her office, people in Main Justice in Washington. And so we begin to see what has become the theme of this Justice Department, which is pursuing the president's revenge sorts of prosecutions, disengaging from prosecutions or investigations that might hamper his political aspirations. And look, I don't need to tell you that this isn't how the Justice Department works. This is how a banana republic works. So the idea that the former FBI director or New York State's Attorney General now stand indicted in cases so weak that career prosecutors resigned rather than have to bring them tells you pretty much all that you need to know. Again, it is deeply, deeply disturbing. And look, you can't have constant outrage, right? I mean, we do have to have some space to enjoy our lives. But so much of this is so outrageous all at once.
Well, so that sense of not being able to have constant outrage and needing to have space in our lives, that's something that you write about in the book.
Yeah.
And kind of what it was like so much for many people in the moment, months immediately after the election and the inauguration, and then where we are now. So what's the metaphor you would talk about, sort of use to talk about what's at stake here, and how we need to approach this?
It's been interesting watching the shifts. I'm sure that y'all remember the deer in the headlights moment, where nobody could believe what our fellow citizens had agreed to do. I think people were stunned. There was so much disappointment. What I remember that disturbed me the most right after the election was people who had just decided that they had had enough and that they needed to walk away. I heard people say things like, I gave this election everything that I had. I did everything that I could do. And now I'm not going to do anything else. I'm just going to walk away, let the cards fall where they may. That felt frighteningly dangerous to me. That felt like we were going to let Trump win without challenging what we knew his agenda would be, because many of us had studied Project 2025. And so we had a good idea of what was coming. And that's really the moment that animated the book, was my fear that we would give up and that would be just simply un-American in that moment. You know, we had experienced, speaking of metaphors, this sort of frog in the pot of hot water moment during the first Trump administration, where it just happened gradually early on. It was easy for people not to pay attention. A lot of folks had voted for Trump. They thought it would be good for their pocketbook. They felt like it was, and it was, you know, a while before they felt the temperature of the family separation policy or the kleptocracy, the violations of the emoluments clause that had become rampant. And so it really was that frog at the slow boil moment. And yet here we are again, having not learned that lesson and having to repeat it.
We're also seeing frogs in another light.
We are, aren't we? Y'all's neighbors to the north.
And a few, I think, certainly in San Jose, at least one at the recent No Kings protest.
I spoke with a really nice guy last night who brought me his book to sign and told me he was frog and unicorn adjacent, which sounded like, you know, I wanted to go.
Well, so speaking of up north, I mean,
Yeah.
So here we are having our conversation today, and there's one of the things that you address in the book, and that I think many of our audience members are living, is sort of this sense of a constant barrage.
Yes.
So what is happening today? So what is happening today in connection with Portland and Chicago?
I mean, first let me address the barrage and say this. My good friend Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who's a scholar in authoritarianism, likes to say that flooding you with, you know, constant stuff, what Steve Bannon referred to as flooding the zone with, right? This constant feeling of being overwhelmed by everything that's happening, that is deliberate. That is a tactic that wannabe strongmen or dictators use to try to get people to tune out because it's just too much to take in all at once. So armed with that knowledge, I think it becomes easier for us to stay engaged and to understand that in those moments that we feel overwhelmed, that's normal. That's not something that's wrong with us. That's something that's being imposed upon us, and that we must simply fight harder to stay engaged, knowing what the stakes are. Yeah, you know, so what's happening today is utterly fascinating, and I'm sure that y'all are up to date on this. We've got cases in both the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, that's Chicago, and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, that's y'all, involving Trump's efforts to deploy, to first federalize and then deploy National Guard units to fight crimes on American streets. There's something that's called the Posse Comitatus Act, a very, very deeply ingrained principle as well as a law that says that you don't use troops, you don't use militia to enforce laws against American civilians, absent very rare exceptions. Invasion, rebellion, and then when the president can't enforce the law with existing forces. And that's what Donald Trump is claiming in his orders federalizing the troops, that crime is so bad, so rampant in places like Los Angeles and Portland and Chicago that he needs to federalize Guard troops and send them in. Early on in these cases, and this is very early on, the courts aren't deciding the substantive issues yet. They're simply deciding whether courts can issue stays that tell the president, look, we're going to freeze the status quo. You're not going to send Guard troops in while the courts are deciding these issues. So understand this is a really early preliminary stage, and I've just condensed like 2.5 years of law school into a minute. So bear with me. I mean, it's the technical stuff that we're all learning now, but this is just about, can a court issue an order that says, while I'm considering this case, nobody can do anything. We're just going to freeze the status quo. And the Trump administration has said, you know, no thank you. We would like to have the ability to deploy troops while all this is going on. So that's the disputes currently taking place in the Ninth and the Seventh Circuit. Seventh Circuit case is sitting in front of the Supreme Court now on a petition for the court to decide that stay issue. And in the Ninth Circuit today, to the point of your question, you know, a panel had, let's see, I've got to remember which day of the week is, had last week, a panel that divided 2-1 permitted the Trump administration to deploy troops while the litigation proceeded. Today, the full court, in what's called an en banc, has decided to rehear that panel decision. That's pretty unusual for that to happen. I know, right? Let me tell you something interesting that we learned and that may have animated the court's decision. I mean, it may have been on this track in any event. The dissenting judge, Judge Graber, wrote just a spectacular dissent where she strongly encouraged the court to rehear the case en banc. It turns out the state of Oregon filed a notification with the court saying, we think that a key piece of evidence that the government relied on may have been falsified. Not good, right? The government had represented that 151 Federal Protective Service agents, that's a federal entity that guards federal property, that they had been deployed to Portland, and that had really sucked the life out of that agency, forcing them to allocate all those resources there. And Oregon said, you know, we got some discovery from the federal government, and in the course of looking through it, it appears that those people never were deployed to Portland. So I think the court will want to inquire and to find out what the truth is in this situation, just to satisfy themselves that there is a factual predicate for their decision to let the federal government deploy. Don't have a strong feeling about what way they'll come out. I think the factual inquiry will be very interesting.
Since you've also brought up the Supreme Court, all right.
Really, we have to go here?
Well, when you started writing the book, right? I mean, you certainly have a sense of like, okay, things are going to work their way to the Supreme Court, and they may be the last best hope.
Yeah.
So last best hope still?
Well, I'm going to push back a little bit. I don't think I've viewed the court for many years as our last best hope. What I have hoped is that they have a sense of self-preservation. Because what's really at stake in these cases is whether the Supreme Court will continue to be a relevant, vibrant institution in American society. Donald Trump is challenging the court's ability to review his decisions. So in the National Guard cases, the government is arguing that once the president decides he needs more resources for law enforcement purposes, the courts can't second guess him. And we have, for instance, in Portland, Oregon, a federal district judge who said the president's assertion that he needs more resources just doesn't pass the smell test. There hasn't been violence here in weeks. What happened early on was very minimal. The National Guardsmen are out gardening in Washington, D.C., for heaven's sakes. This just is not realistic, and the president is not entitled to make stuff up in order to use these sorts of resources in this way. And that's the issue, whether or not the Roberts Court believes that it's still entitled to engage in judicial review, almost as old as our country, right, and deeply ingrained in the court system. Perhaps the Roberts Court will decide to put itself out of business and make itself irrelevant. My hope is that they at least want to hold on to their own power and prestige.
Well, so one of the things that you do write in the book is there's of a moment when Vice President J.D. Vance, no relation, right?
No relation. As we say in the South, we are not kin.
A Yale-educated lawyer suggests that the response to courts that rule against the administration should be ignoring their decisions.
Yeah, so this is such a disturbing moment. It's early in the deportation cases. It's clear that a judge named Jeb Boasberg in the District of Columbia is going to rule against the government on this notion that the government can suddenly pick up people and send them to a prison in El Salvador that's used for terrorists, where the conditions are so bad it would never pass muster in our country. It would clearly violate the Eighth Amendment prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. I'm sure y'all remember the videos, and I don't need to tell you, but the conditions that these men were subjected to were just absolutely inhumane. And in that moment, on Twitter, of all places, where I guess everything important still happens, the Vice President of the United States, a Yale-educated lawyer, as you say, and senators with law degrees, including a former prosecutor, weighed in and talked about the war that the courts were waging on the administration, and opined that, maybe you could just ignore court decisions that you don't like. I'm here to tell you that that's not how any of this works, right? If you don't like a decision that a district judge renders, it's really easy. You just appeal it to the Court of Appeals, and then you go on to the Supreme Court. And whether you like the court's decisions or not, you follow them because that's the way we order our society. Without that, we would be chaotic. We would have no way of resolving our disputes. We send our most serious disputes to the courts to resolve because we cannot resolve them among ourselves. That's as true if you're a president as it is if you are a litigant in a civil case. And look, I don't always like the Supreme Court's decisions, right? I'm not a huge fan of reversing Roe versus Wade, among other things. But when the court speaks, we follow those decisions. We might look for other lawsuits we can file to try to chip away at precedent we don't like. That's how we got a civil rights movement in this country. But we obey those orders. The idea that the vice president suggested that we shouldn't, I think, is utterly appalling. It's unforgivable. It's something he cannot be given a pass for, ever.
So let me ask one of the big questions that you ask in the book, and not just rhetorically. Why have a democracy at all?
So some of y'all may be in this position. I have a 22-year-old. My 22-year-old's first recollection of a presidency is Donald Trump's first term. Yeah, I know, right? I had that same reaction. What happened was I started talking with him about, do you want to read my book? Do you want to talk about my book? And he was really singularly not interested, but he's a super polite kid, so he was pretending. And I said, well, Ollie, what would it take you and your friends, what would it take for me to get y'all interested? Because, in Alabama, we worry about the phenomenon that other states worry about, low voter turnout among voters between the ages of 18 and 29. And if even 10% more of those voters turned out, it's likely that Alabama would have a lot more Democratic elected officials than it currently has statewide, which is 0. And so I was really interested, why doesn't this interest you? You grew up in a political household, you should be fascinated by this. And I was like, don't you want to go protest? His sister wanted to protest. And he said, Mom, I was 4 when Occupy happened, and nothing has changed. Wealthy people still control Congress and the caucuses. And his very jaded, but also unfortunately accurate view made me think something we've failed to do, that we really have to do, is make the case for why we should have a democracy, right? In my generation, that's a given. We had the luxury of taking democracy for granted. It was always going to be here. There were challenges. It met the challenges. It moved forward. It was imperfect, but it aspired to always do better. And the promise of America expanded to include more and more people. That was my vision of democracy. It is not his. And I realized that we have just a foundational failure to do civics education right in this country. We do it in school. A lot of kids fall in love with law and democracy in school. But it needs to be more than that. It needs to be part of the culture. And people who study democracies that have reemerged from communism, especially in Eastern Europe, have made this point. You can teach people about democracy, but then they have to have lived experience with it. And so I try in so many ways to think about what that can and should look like. What does it look like in your neighborhood to drink beer on people's front porch and talk a little bit about democracy around the edges? Do you read books with people in your book club, both fiction and nonfiction? And how do you talk to your kids? Take them with you to vote. Talk with them about candidates. And I think most importantly, convey to them this sense, the Winston Churchill line, right? Democracy is the worst system of government ever envisioned, except for everything else. This notion that if we want to have the possibility of making progress, it is our best bet. And without it, the world that our kids inherit from us will not be a very pretty one.
See, my ears always perk up whenever you bring in Central and Eastern Europe, having been one of the first Peace Corps volunteers in Ukraine and observed elections in the former Soviet Union over the last 25 years. One of the points you make in the book, which is important, is how the U.S. was a beacon of democracy for now former Soviet satellites, right? And for the Arab
Yes.
Spring as well. But those, we're talking about late 80s, early 90s, and 2010, 2012. We're not talking about since 2016, 17.
You know, we're not, at the Justice Department, we used to have this extraordinary rule of law program where Justice Department lawyers would volunteer to go abroad to train prosecutors and judges on how systems work. And the same thing at the State Department, where they had a rule of law program where they engaged with other countries. You know, people in public health, which is, I just think, utterly fascinating. I view public health as an institution. It's a debate that I'm having with some colleagues in public health who say, we're not an institution. You can have public health in countries that are not democracies, which is a very good point. But I've increasingly come to view public health as one of these institutions that expands democracy by expanding equity and opportunity. I mean, these are doctors who worry about fairness and how people are treated, which seems very consistent, to me at least, with other institutions. And they too were part of the United States being involved in the international spread of rule of law. Of course, that's gone almost overnight with the end of USAID, with the end of programs that brought medical care and brought food and brought other advances to people in foreign countries. And look, those programs were good in and of themselves, right, as people who volunteered like you in the Peace Corps understand, but they were also a part of our foreign policy. And they were also a part of keeping conditions stable in countries, for instance, in Central America, which helped to tamp down on immigration. So, you know, none of this happens in a vacuum, and the policy failures that we are living through will have implications long term.
So one of the things that you mentioned early on in writing the book, as you were kind of wrestling with, how do I do this? You say it had become easy to see where we were weak. It was more difficult to see where we were strong. So where are we still strong?
Yes, so, you know, I started writing this book in January of this year. And then there was an inauguration, and then there was the open fire hose, and I spent a lot of time just tearing up stuff that I wrote, right? Because it felt like every day the administration was rapidly implementing pieces of Project 2025, which we had expected, but they were immaculately well organized. It was this everywhere, everything all at once that I don't think anyone had anticipated, and that Democrats and other people who love democracy were simply not prepared for. I mean, that was just really an utterly amazing moment, I think, that left many of us gobsmacked and paralyzed for the moment and struggling to move forward. And what sort of liberated me to write again was realizing that what this new political movement that was taking over the White House for the second time wanted us to think was that we were weak, right? Wanted us to think that Donald Trump's success was inevitable, that there was nothing that we could do, that we should just step aside because it was pointless. And what I began to think about was, where were we strong? What were our institutional strengths? So you asked the question today, right? I mean, it's more difficult today than it was even in January or February. But I'll tell you, one part of our government that I look to, that I see as being strong, successful, committed, clear, are federal district court judges. The trial judges across the country, right? You know, these folks are quite literally putting themselves in harm's way. I mean, we have a president who apparently thinks nothing of putting a bullseye on the back of a sitting federal judge, and yet they continue to rule. Not only do they rule against the administration sometimes, they are so fair. They are such beacons of the rule of law. They look at the facts. They look at the law. They're fair to the administration. They're fair to the people that are challenging the administration. Even in this decision that we saw, I can't remember now. Oh, I know which decision it is. It's this decision that has said, have any of y'all seen this today, involving the gentleman at Customs and Border Patrol, who a judge has now ordered to report every evening at 6 p.m. to talk about how they're conducting their raids. And the judge said, look, there are some situations where I will permit you to use tear gas without warning the crowd. If you're at risk, if there's a threat to law. I mean, just bending over backwards to get it right. I have so much respect for the judges who are doing this. I understand, if any of you are looking for something that you can do, that there's actually a post-writing adventure underway where, have you seen about people who write postcards to voters in other states? If you're in a blue state, you write to folks in a purple state. Well, there are folks who are writing postcards to judges. Judges who've issued some of these rulings, just saying, I've got your back. And some of these judges are getting these beautifully illustrated or quirky or funny cards. I think that's just a lovely, low-key way that we can support people who are standing up for democracy. They are certainly an example of our strength. There are federal employees who are continuing to do their job at great personal risk, because when you get fired, in that peremptory fashion, you lose all of the years that you've built up towards your retirement and towards your family's security. And so in Congress, where we're seeing senators and members of Congress stand up, it is not everyone who is falling down. A supine Congress doesn't mean every member is failing to do their job. There are those who are. Those are the people we need to celebrate, support, and emulate.
Well, you talk about the danger that the judges are putting themselves in. I mean, that's something that you know from personal family history as well.
It's very different. My father-in-law was an 11th Circuit judge. He was killed by a mail bomb sent by a dissatisfied litigant. And it's tragic. It's something that we'll always live with. We were one of just a handful of judges' families who had that experience. The problem now is that the threat to our judges is coming from the White House. And that's just an unbelievable sorrow and sadness for our country to face. The fact that there are Republicans, and look, I think it's important for us to try to be fair when we assess these situations and not to overstate, not to place all the blame on one side of the political aisle. But here we have something where Republicans should stand up and tell the leader of their party that it's unacceptable to threaten federal judges. And the fact that that hasn't happened is utterly shameful.
So talking about democratic institutions, you're actually teaching a course on that this
I do. I
semester.
teach a seminar in that every year. It was a lot easier to teach it 10 years ago.
Yeah, so how is it, what's one of the biggest things that you're wrestling with now? The stability of the institutions, the fact that they're weaker than we hoped?
It's dangerous to take the temperature of the institutions every day, right? I mean, the long slide of history is a better indication of where they are. I'll tell you something fascinating that I discuss with my students. It's something that I focus on more and more. It's one of our incredible strengths. It's the United States military, which as an institution not only promotes service to country, but in many ways exemplifies the best way to go about things. Integration, right? The military, early adopter. This notion that leaders should explain themselves to the people who work for them, in essence. And this fascinating technique that the military uses of stand-downs, where they spend time to evaluate problems. They did this after January 6th, where a commander talks with everyone in his command, or where an army leader talks with everyone in his command, to get a sense of how are we doing? Where do we need to be re-educated? What do we have to work on? And I'm reminded that just in advance of January 6th, every living Secretary of Defense signed off on a letter in the Washington Post that said the United States military does not decide the outcome of elections. It was a warning to the Trump appointee who had been placed inside of the Defense Department after Trump lost the election. And all of his predecessors said, we are looking at you, and there are expectations about what you will and won't do in this job. Pete Hegseth is obviously a very different kettle of fish. And so something that my students and I have been talking about is, how deeply ingrained is this notion of service in the military? We'll find out, but it looks pretty deeply ingrained in people who have been through the service academies, people who cherish constitutional values, people who understand that they have a painful responsibility not to obey an unconstitutional order, which, look, that's not, you may not like an order that you get in this chain of command. You're still obligated to follow it. There is some species of orders that could constitute illegal, unconstitutional orders. I would expect that there would be a lot of lawyers counseling folks in the military. Unfortunately, they've let go of a lot of the experienced JAG lawyers, but obviously there's private support, retired military support for people who are serving. And I think we can count on the military as an institution to be the best among us.
So you mentioned elections, right? The military not deciding them. Certainly, elections are something you address in the book, and people have asked you about regularly. Some folks here, will there be a next election even?
Yeah. I am actually very confident that there will be elections in 2026 and 2028 for this reason. Wannabe dictators love to cloak themselves in the veneer of legitimacy, right? And nothing says you're legitimate like being able to claim that you were elected and that you serve pursuant to the will of the people. That's why Vladimir Putin still holds elections in Russia. The issue, I think, is not will we hold elections, it's will they be free, will they be fair, will our voices be heard. Frankly, we're going to have to work to make sure that that happens. Y'all are experiencing that here, where Justice Department observers, I understand, will descend on some California counties in this election in what can only be perceived as a trial balloon for 2026. This is just, I'm from Alabama. We understand voter intimidation in Alabama. This is an effort to intimidate voters. The Justice Department does, through the Civil Rights Division, send out poll watchers. It does that in cases where the right to vote is being suppressed or it's at risk of being suppressed. This looks very much like the opposite of that. It looks like an effort to intimidate people. No one is protected from untrue allegations that they're engaging in voter fraud. And even if they're ultimately discarded as false, the process of being subject to an investigation can be very painful. And we now live in a world where we know that the Justice Department is willing to engage in prosecutions that advance the political agenda of the moment. So when the Justice Department says it's coming out to look for fraud, right? I think that that's a moment where some people might think, well, I'm just going to stay home and not vote. That's something that we're going to have to take on as a community. We are going to have to talk with our friends, our family members, the people around us about the importance not just of voting, but of educating yourself about the candidates. And in 2026, voting for people who believe in democracy, small d, not necessarily Democrats, voting for candidates that you are confident will advance country over party in the next Congress, which will be incredibly important to our future. So, short answer, we will face a lot of challenges. I'm convinced we're up for it. Our elections are held at the state and local level, not the federal level. There's something for everybody to do. Be a counter poll watcher. Volunteer to work in the election. Run forums for candidates where people can hear them speak. Or just have patient conversations with friends. Remind them to register. Make sure they have ID on hand. There's a good chance we will have to prove that we are citizens in order to register in the upcoming election, as horrible as that is. It's nothing short of a poll tax, right? It's just you have $200 to get documents and a passport. So as communities, we will have to help people who can't afford that to make sure that they have qualifying identification. It's going to be an all-of-community effort. Ultimately, though, it may backfire on this administration because, nobody works this hard to take away your right to vote unless it's powerful, unless it really matters. I think Americans will understand that, and they will insist on exercising their rights, because nothing makes you want to do that as much as being told you can't or you shouldn't.
It's one of our audience members is citing something that you said earlier, that how we can really have an impact. You said you don't have to take it on all at once, right? Then this person said, I had an unexpected emotional response. It was like a huge relief.
Yeah.
So what else? What other advice would you give for kind of being able to sustain yourself
Well,
in this moment?
let's start with that piece, because have I mentioned I'm from Alabama? You know, my father-in-law was involved in the civil rights movement before he became a judge, and involved in integrating Alabama's Democratic Party, which just used to be a really horribly segregated piece of trash. I mean, seriously. But, you know, I have had this unbelievable opportunity to speak with some of the original foot soldiers who marched in Birmingham, who walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. And my husband, who likes his religion with a side helping of good food, goes to this, it's a fellowship breakfast on Sunday morning that circulates through the historic black churches in Birmingham. And you hear a lot of wisdom in those rooms. And something that I've learned from people who were in the movement is that you should never worry alone. You should never fight the bad guy alone. And what's so important for us is to build community. That might be an online community. It might be an in-person community. You might have more than one community. But this notion that the whole burden of this horrible time we live through doesn't sit just on your shoulders alone, and that you can share it with people, I think it provokes relief. It also makes it possible for us to act, because if you're writing postcards to voters with 20 other people, if you're marching with friends, if you're reading a book together, there are so many opportunities. And you begin to see that if we just each do what we're personally passionate about, there are other people filling in those other spaces. The lady who said it takes a village was actually right, it turns out. And if we all just do our bit, then we continue to advance towards where we will need to be to reclaim this country.
I think, you know, I mean, since you mentioned just now the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and, you know, you've talked about being in this moment and seeing if this is how things are, you know, what can we possibly do? If you actually have a sense of more of the sweep of history, there's a sense of possibility that comes with that. And one of the things that comes clear, and even in the timeline that you work with in the book, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech was in August 63.
Yeah.
It was 2 years later that the police came after marchers and
That's right.
On the bridge. So it wasn't like that everything got better after MLK's speech.
You know, it's such a long sweep of time, and it would have been so easy to just give up. We had the conversation earlier about people that are just willing to give up on democracy. But if you look to history, you see, for instance, the integration of the University of Alabama. One of the women involved was a student named Vivian Malone Jones, and she had, sure enough, a tough time, right? She was going to classes when bombs were going off close to her apartment. She sticks it out, she graduates, she goes to work, she has a tremendous career. And when the 50th anniversary of the integration of the University of Alabama is celebrated, the sitting Attorney General, Eric Holder, is her brother-in-law. I mean, it's not a straight line, but it's quite a compelling argument for sticking with it. And I think about that and how easy it would have been for her to reject a government that had, in essence, abandoned her, and how much strength it takes to say, no, I see the promise, and what I want to do is work to expand the promise instead of abandon it. That's how the sweep of history, I think, informs what we need to do right now and how we should react to what we're seeing.
So one of the members of the audience here asks, to what extent should we be concerned about what is happening to our federal civil service? And I'll pair that with something that you note in the book: a president who wants to do away with restraints on the way he exercises power will weaken or try to fatally damage the institutions that can check him.
And it's all about damaging the checks, right? The theme of this administration, and I mean, this is maybe a little bit boring and theoretical, but there's this theory called the unitary executive that says the presidency should be more powerful than the other two branches of government. That, of course, flies in the face of the intent of the founders, who believed that we should not have a king, who created this form of government in reaction to their dislike of kings and their rules, and decentralized power in three branches of government. But nonetheless, we now have a president who's trying to accumulate more power in his own hands. And so that's very much what we see in that moment. I think that's just the theme for all of this. It's the question of who will hold someone accountable who wants to accumulate that excessive power, and wrongfully so. Who will speak out? How will we restore the balance? That's really very much, I think, what overlies these kind of questions.
Well, and so having brought up the unitary executive theory, you also note in the book that this is a theory that came out of small government conservatives originally. Right?
I mean, this is a theory that develops really after Watergate, and it's very much sort of on the fringes of the right wing, and it comes more into the mainstream during the first Trump administration. There were people like, for instance, Bill Barr, Trump's third attorney general, who were advocates for that. Oh, the presidency is all powerful, Barr wrote in this memo that he circulated when he was sort of auditioning for the job. A memo that suggested, for instance, that presidents couldn't be subject to criminal penalties for any of their conduct, an idea that at the time was shocking, but that's now the law of the land. And so this notion of a more powerful presidency has really sort of come out of darkness into the light. There are reasons to believe that to sort of varying extents, at least 5, maybe even 6 of the Supreme Court justices ascribed to some of it. And as you say, it comes from small government conservatives who were writing in reaction to the idea that within the executive branch of government, there could be career employees with expertise who could make decisions. And what it really amounted to, quite frankly, was a lot of dissatisfaction with EPA, which used science to impose limits on big business, or the Department of Education that required, for instance, that kids with special needs receive education that was appropriate. And that expanded across the federal agencies, where they were perceived as being anti-business and interfering with people's ability to do whatever they wanted to do. But, it's super ironic to me that the states' rights Republicans, and I'll tell y'all, my law school roommate, my longtime close friend, is a Tea Party conservative. So we have for years gone back and forth on these issues. And her response was always states' rights. We need to preserve the rights of states. And those same folks, thank goodness, not my roommate, who's a sensible woman, but those same people are now saying, using the National Guard from Texas to go into California or Oregon, that's absolutely fine. And so I think that they will have a moment of confrontation where they will have to deal with that hypocrisy, or at least I hope that they will. But in many ways, that undercuts the rationale that they've used for the unitary executive theory, this idea that we need a powerful presidency to offset the influence of these bureaucrats.
You also note that this theory, kind of taken to its maybe most dangerous extreme, jibes very well with a leader like Viktor Orban from Hungary, right?
It does. Orban, who promotes his illiberal democracy, right, as though it's something to be proud of, and who has candidly advised this president, about the need to reform bureaucracy in order to consolidate control. I mean, I think we should all be frightened that CPAC, goes to Hungary and permits somebody like Orban to speak to them. And we've seen other leaders who are far less than democratic, for instance, Bukele in El Salvador, who on Twitter has exchanges with leading American politicians, including the vice president, and advocates for reforming the judiciary. So look, this is not something covert that's happening. They are talking about creating an illiberal democracy, which is no democracy at all, in our country. And the one thing we cannot say is that we weren't on notice, that we weren't aware. And I worry so much about the people who just put their heads in the sand and say, it's too much, I can't look at this, who essentially just are hoping somebody else will fix their problems for them. And I'm here to say, I understand that it's tough and it's difficult, and sometimes I just want to go home and sleep for 24 hours. But we can do that when this is over. We have a moment ahead of us, especially the next 13 months, where we just can't afford to let it go.
Well, here's one audience member that's sort of, I guess, the Thoreau approach to what I might do. My federal taxes are going for things I totally detest and not for what helps keep our country and citizens safe. What would happen if we all withheld our estimated taxes?
Yeah, so look, I'm a former United States attorney. I do not advise failing to pay your taxes. What I think we can do and should do is engage our representatives in conversation about how we feel about this use of taxpayer funding. I mean, I can think of a lot of things that I would prefer my taxpayer funds not be used for, like the judgment fund at the Justice Department that's used to pay people who on rare occasions are the victims of improper litigation by the Justice Department. And apparently you and I are going to give this president $230 million because career prosecutors had the audacity to go to grand juries with evidence, and those grand juries chose to indict strong cases where we've all seen much of the evidence, and those cases terminated not because a judge said that they were flawed, but because Donald Trump won re-election, and Justice Department policy says you can't prosecute a sitting president. I mean, there is nothing bad, rotten, flawed, coercive about those prosecutions that would merit 5 cents coming out of the judgment fund, let alone $230 million. However, the appropriate way for us being respectful of the rule of law, because what we don't want to do is we don't want to become them. We don't want to become people who are cavalier about compliance with the law, who don't respect it, even though I totally get the urge to not want to pay your taxes in this moment. Y'all have got, some very fine elected representatives who I think are on our side of this matter, but I think telling them that you support them, especially your senators, in their efforts to require oversight of this administration, it really matters. I mean, hard to believe that our senators are just human beings at the end of the day, but they face a lot of pressure. And knowing that their constituents want and maybe even demand that they engage on these inquiries and really articulating your views about the tax issue and saying, look, I'm an American citizen. I'm going to continue to pay taxes. I want you engaged in the fight for what those taxes will go for. Congress has the power of the purse. That's given to it under Article 1 of the Constitution. And this Congress, because it's just absolutely supine, is permitting Donald Trump to take over that power, both to fail to spend money that they've allocated and to spend funds that they really have not allocated. It's time for Congress to take that back. We talked about the Supreme Court making itself irrelevant. Congress is doing a fine job of that too, the Republicans in Congress. We need to support the good folks who want to see Congress do its job.
So let's talk a little bit about some prepositions, of, by, and for.
Of, by, and for. I think I've heard those in connection with the people.
Has decades of taken democracy granted mean we've let this slip away?
The vision for this country, when it was formed, was that this sort of just amazing political, philosophical debate that goes on among the founding fathers, which accepts the notion that power belongs to the people and that they cede some portion of their individual power, like your freedom to just plop down your house wherever you want to, or make noise when you want to, or what have you, that we were willing to cede some of our individual power to a government so that government could put in place systems that would allow people to live together peacefully, and it would maximize people's opportunity to make their own decisions and live their life as they chose to without interference from, say, a monarch who suddenly decides you can't hunt in those woods and I'll kill you if you go out and hunt in those woods, right? Remove the arbitrary and capricious from government. That's the original vision. And although this country, the Constitution is born with the original sin of slavery, something that we haven't fully addressed in this country. And democracy is aspirational in so many ways. I think we all understand that. It's not a perfect democracy. It's a process that we move towards. But we have been blessed as a nation since the Civil War with the ability to take democracy largely for granted, because it does succeed in so many ways. And the challenges that we faced didn't feel like the sort of existential challenges where you questioned whether you would wake up in the morning and there would still be a democracy. And that in many ways made us complacent as a people. It was the thing that permitted us to, sideswipe government and to trash talk Congress and the president without thinking really about the implications of that for having government do what we desperately all need it to do so we can have happy, satisfying lives. It's a moment where we can't do that anymore. We will have to reclaim this democracy, and then the challenge will be figuring out, and I think a lot of this is having to revitalize civics education and civics engagement, which I write about in the book, doing that in a way where we no longer take democracy for granted, where it does stay front and center. We have all these Monday holidays. They should be more than just days off, right? We can put the content back into them. We can think about what it means to have elections as joyous celebrations, not as sort of somber duties. There are a lot of ways where we can restore the emphasis on democracy as opposed to simply taking it for granted. But that, again, is something that will require us in our communities to decide that that matters and that it's important. And I think for our generation, for my generation, that that's a gift that we need to give to the people who come after us.
So if I've done my homework right, the day we're having this conversation is also the anniversary of the dedication of the Statue of Liberty.
No kidding, is it really?
We're also in the midst of government shutdown.
We are, the longest one ever.
And one of the things that you write about in the book, and you'll see where I'm going with this, is the Hatch Act.
Yes.
As well. You've done some traveling to get here by airplane, coming through different airports. The Hatch Act figures into that as well.
It does. I mean, y'all know the Hatch Act, right, prohibits government employees from engaging in political behavior on the taxpayer's nickel. It's something that's so deeply ingrained in federal employees that nobody ever really questioned it. My husband, so in Alabama, we elect our judges. My husband would run for election. I was so happy. I never had to go to anything political. I couldn't go. And my husband at one point ran to be the Chief Justice of our Supreme Court and lost because he's a Democrat. But the kids had to go with him. And I didn't do anything. I didn't raise money. I didn't participate. Because it would have been unseemly for a federal employee to do something like that, even in a judicial race. I mean, you don't put a bumper sticker on your car if you're going to drive in and out of a government building. We didn't even put political signs on our front lawn. The idea that we now have a country where during a shutdown, the websites for federal agencies blame Democrats for the shutdown is appalling. And if any of y'all read my newsletter, I don't know how I found this. I just stumbled. I guess I was looking up the Hatch Act, and I go to the Justice Department website page that talks about the Hatch Act, and at the top of that page, I see, we're in a shutdown because the Democrats, it just boggles the mind sometimes, right? The Hatch Act clearly does not matter in this administration. It did not matter in the first Trump administration. My good friend, my podcast co-host, Jill Wine-Banks, who some of you may be familiar with. Jill, the only woman on the Watergate prosecution team. Jill has told me for years that it was a failure at the end of the Nixon administration to not prosecute Nixon. It was a failure not to take these new rules that we created for ethics and codify them into law with consequences. They're all norms. It's all soft norms. And she makes that point that we need to put teeth into rules like the Hatch Act. She is absolutely right.
And maybe just to connect the final dots for someone who might not know. So in airports and the Hatch Act.
Yeah. I left that out. Yeah, Kristi Noem, right, the DHS secretary, who's, as we're all waiting in the TSA lines, peddling the same stuff. Unbelievable. Although, so many cities, I think maybe a majority of cities, have simply refused to put them up.
So you talk about failure to grapple with the consequences of Watergate. In the book,
Yeah.
Of course, you address January 6th.
Yeah.
And the initial outrage, even among some Republicans.
I quote all the Republicans. When I talk about January 6th in the book, I just let the Republicans describe it for us.
Right, what Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy had to say. Right. Has a failure to grapple with that? Has that led us to where we are now in this moment?
The failure of accountability is going to be a long-term problem for us. And I draw a little bit of a comparison to the Civil War, where there actually were some prosecutions of Confederate leaders at the end of the Civil War with pretty minimal jail time, and then this very generous, over-generous restoration of citizenship at the end of it. And that really gave rise to this myth in the Deep South of the lost cause, this romanticized notion of slavery and the Confederacy that allowed people to escape responsibility, to escape a true reckoning, and that led to Jim Crow and to much of where the South is these days. I think I probably have not made any friends among conservatives in the South by doing this, but I view that as being very similar to what has happened with January 6th, except that this has happened on a much speedier timeline. Donald Trump comes into office, undoes all of those prosecutions, rechristens these folks as patriots. Many of them are now in government jobs. It is an astonishing walk back from the accountability that was never completed. I say this not critically of the Biden administration, because I understand that the goal was to permit the country to move forward and survive. But I think with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that the failure to demand accountability from the leaders who were responsible for the efforts to deny the outcome of the 2020 election, that in large part has put us where we are now. And I suppose it's a future lesson on the virtues of accountability, but it's also an American tragedy.
So you talked earlier about the military, and one of the hopeful stories you tell involves CBS News show 60 Minutes.
Yes.
And a Marine band concert. Tell that story and what happened.
This is one of my favorite stories in the book, and I think it's why Donald Trump hates 60 Minutes so much. Tail end of the Biden administration, the president's own band, a military band, had held a contest for students from across the country, student musicians, students of color. And they were all supposed to come to Washington and play a concert with the president's own band, a really big honor for a young student, right? Only one problem. Early on, after Trump issues the anti-DEI orders and cancels DEI programming, some smart moron decides that they can't let the concert go forward because it's based on DEI principles, and these are a bunch of black kids coming to Washington, and they cancel it. The same people who organized that original concert decided that they couldn't let it go. And so they reached out to retired military band members who agreed to come to Washington, agreed to find the resources to bring the kids in so that they could play a concert. And a producer at 60 Minutes got wind of it. 60 Minutes ends up deciding, oh, this is really great. We're going to put the concert on the air. And so the concert gets seen by millions of viewers on television instead of just by, a couple of hundred people live. And it is the story of what we can all do when we work together, with maybe a side dose of how important the free press is.
Well, so not to be a downer, but I will, of course, note.
A lot of this is downer stuff, right? I mean, we are not about sugarcoating this. We just can't afford to do that.
Right. So that was in March. In April, Bill Owens, who had
Yes.
headed up 60 Minutes, resigned.
Yes.
Right. And then this week, John Dickerson, a longtime CBS News journalist, announced that he'll be stepping down.
Yeah. We are in a moment of sad transition with traditional media, right? I mean, it's newspapers, it's television. I think we're all changing how we get our news. And maybe that's not ultimately terrible. We used to be a country that only read newspapers, and then we were a country that listened on the radio. Then we watched TV. We morphed to the internet. That came with some real problems with disinformation. And we're seeing what for me has been just this fascinating notion on Substack and other places of people who write in specific niche areas of expertise. So if you're unfamiliar, Substack is just a platform. All different kinds of people write newsletters on it. I, for instance, sometimes indulge in the fashion newsletters, which are very interesting. But I write one about the intersection of law and politics. I read a number of others from people, by the way, across the spectrum. I like to read conservative theorists as well as people who are far more liberal than I am. And I read in the area of public health. I read The Economists. So you can, in essence, curate what you want to learn about. And if you're willing to be outside of a bubble where you're just hearing stuff that reinforces your own beliefs, you can do a pretty interesting job of educating yourself. It reminds me of the early days of Twitter, when for a decade I didn't tweet, but I used Twitter to amalgamate all these other newspapers. Like, I could never have afforded to subscribe to all of them, but I could read, the paper in Jerusalem and London and New York and Los Angeles and get all of these different views by going to Twitter, which I thought was utterly phenomenal. And I still feel that way, quite frankly. I use a lot of social media platforms in that way. But I think we're seeing this Substack phenomenon, and I'm sure platforms other than Substack will emerge that will do this same thing. Many of the shows do newsletters, right? There's Punchbowl that you can read in the morning. A lot of the different traditional news outlets do that. I saw this morning that Morning Joe on MSNBC has started one called The Tea, so I'm hoping that means we'll get insider political gossip. We have to work harder to educate ourselves in a time where the 3 networks on TV don't just deliver the news, and we can consume it because we have confidence in the journalistic credentials of the people that are bringing it to us. Like exercising your right to vote, acquiring news has become much more challenging. But that is, in fact, the world we live in, and something that we'll all have to make peace with.
Well, unfortunately, we've reached the time where we have time for just one more question. We talked about frogs at the beginning. Let's talk about chickens.
It always goes here.
So, any important updates or advice from Pickles?
Pickles is, if you read my newsletter, you've seen Pickles, who jumps up on my shoulder every time I turn my back to her. Did not know when we got chickens that they had such big, bright personalities. But they do. And look, the whole chicken thing was a little bit strange. It was a pandemic thing in our family, and we absolutely adore it now, and it makes us really happy. I think that's what we all have to find right now. We're not going to get through this by running a marathon, or, we have to understand that it's a marathon, that we can't run it fast and hard like a sprint, and that you need to find stuff like My Silly Chickens that will bring you joy along the way. So my hope is that you'll read the book, you'll accept that sort of Kamala Harris-esque message of finding joy, and that we'll get out on the other side of this.
Well, our thanks to Joyce Vance, author of Giving Up
Thank you.
is Unforgivable, a manual for keeping a democracy. We encourage you to pick up a copy of Joyce's book here or at your local bookstore. And for information about Commonwealth Club World Affairs membership and upcoming programs, please visit commonwealthclub.org. I'm Stephen Sound. Thank you and take care.